Good evening. My name is Heather Woodruff, and I'm a junior here at Harvard College, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, as I am both a fellow Cornhusker and a member of the Harvard Republican Club Board. Senator Hagel represents two things that are very near and dear to my heart. The first of those is the Institute of Politics. He has been kind enough over the last few years to serve on our Senior Advisory Board, which is the body that determines the future of this institute that we all know and love so well. And the second thing is that he represents the great state of Nebraska. And people often ask me, many of my friends, what is so special about Nebraska? And I would have to say three things. First of all, our national championship Cornhuskers, who are currently ranked number 3. Secondly is that it's the place where the president goes in a time like September 11th when the country is under attack. And perhaps one of the most well-known things about Nebraska is our guest tonight, Senator Chuck Hagel. I remember the night that Senator Hagel was elected for the first time in 1996, and it was quite a victory for many of us who had helped with his campaign, and really marked a turning point in Nebraska politics as things very much changed hands after he came into control as a senator that immediately rose to find respect in the Senate, even in his first term. What's very unique about the senator is that he was never elected to another office before he was elected to the Senate. And despite that, he has immediately grown to respect in the Senate, both throughout the country, but also in the state of Nebraska. At the largest 4th of July event in the state last summer, he was the one politician that received unanimous applause and a complete standing ovation. Both Republicans and Democrats alike have come to really know and love the senator and respect him in our state and also throughout the country. Again, like I said, despite the fact that this is only his first term, he has been a tremendous leader in the Senate, is well-renowned both for his service to his country during Vietnam and also for his wisdom on domestic issues. And if things keep going the way they are, you never know, he just might make Nebraska proud as president in the future. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce to you Graham Allison. He's the director of the Kennedy School of Government's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. I think it's a good representation of the fact that there are a number of Nebraskans here and a large number of them who are fans of our speaker tonight. It's my great privilege on behalf of Harvard University to welcome Senator Chuck Hagel here and to say how much we are grateful to get him back here in the midst of all the things that are happening in Washington today and in his life today. I think it's a testimony to the courage of this individual that all things happening, he nonetheless, having committed to be here, was here. And I think the fact that he's on the Institute's Senior Advisory Committee made him feel that he had some obligation, but it was an obligation that most of us could have found a way to wiggle out of if he had been interested. But he was here, and we're lucky. Chuck is a fourth-generation Nebraskan and was elected for the first time to the U.S. Senate in 1996. 1 year later, Dave Broder, another local here from time to time, a national columnist, called Senator Hagel, quote, the freshman who has made the deepest impression on his colleagues. And in the Senate, that's not easy to do. Okay. George Will called Chuck a rising star in the Republican Party, and as another one of the national commenters noted very well, he embodies honor and duty. But I like, of the press comments, the FTs the best, who said about Chuck Hagel, a Vietnam War hero with an independent streak and a flair for foreign policy. There's not many of those. And so for those that are there, we're very, very grateful. Now, since he's gotten to the Senate, from the beginning, he's been one of the deputy whips for the Republican Party. He's a member of 5 key committees: the Foreign Relations Committee, the Banking Committee, the Housing and Urban Affairs Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Budget Committee. On the Foreign Relations Committee, he's now the ranking member of the Subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And on the Banking Committee, he serves as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on International Trade and Finance. So he's over the whole spectrum of international affairs at a time when most senators, when they come to the Senate and are doing their committee assignments, stay away from foreign affairs, or have stayed away from foreign affairs until the recent wake-up call. On the Foreign Relations Committee, where I've watched him very closely, he's been among the most influential voices for just good, common, straight sense. Business Week called him rightly an articulate champion of the U.S. global economic leadership, where he's, for example, been one of the major forces pushing for fast-track authority, for trade promotion authority, which Bob Zellick, another one of our local colleagues here, who's the special trade representative now, is eagerly seeking, and which I hope he's going to get in this setting, so that as part of the overall strategy against terrorism, the economic and financial pieces of it will be put in place. But the best line about him, and then I'm going to get on here quickly, is from the Wall Street Journal, who says he's been, quote, a forceful prairie voice, arguing against old-fashioned Midwestern isolationism and advocating instead aggressive involvement in the world, which is exactly right and which has never been needed more than now. Prior to coming to the Senate, Chuck Hagel had a very successful career in business, among other things founding a cellular company which became one of the largest independent cellular companies in the country. But I would just welcome him finally by saying something that I said to him when we were chatting earlier. In an era when it's fashionable to bemoan the absence of leadership and vision in national life, and often in the Senate, and to complain about where is Senator Nunn now that we need him, or where is whoever now that we need him. One of the brightest and strongest shining stars in the new U.S. Senate is Chuck Hagel. And so it's a great honor to hear him tonight on reinventing the world. Chuck Hagel.
Graham, thank you. I am grateful for the introduction and the opportunity to be among you, students, faculty, all you smart Harvard people. Heather, thank you. And Heather never even worked for me and said all those nice things. When Heather said that one of the special things about Nebraska, I was prepared for her to say it's the home of Bob Kerrey. It's a joke, by the way. Many of you know who Bob Kerrey is. He is a dear, dear friend of mine who we are very proud of, and did bring a significant amount of attention to the state of Nebraska, mainly because he dated movie actresses. If you're watching, Bob, that is a joke as well. But Bob Kerrey was a very forceful articulate for engagement and for, as Graham credited me, common sense. The American people possess a great abundance of common sense, and that has probably been the most stabilizing dynamic in the short history of this great country. Before I get to my remarks, I want to thank Bill White and Kathy McLaughlin, and of course Graham, others here, for their assistance and guidance and support and help, since I am just a mere mortal member of the trustees, senior advisory committee. I recognize my place, and whatever Kathy says, we do. So Kathy, my dear, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. I have some people here tonight, too. I want to recognize there are Nebraskans in the audience, as Graham and Heather mentioned. Some were interns for me this year, last year. Maddie is here, and Maddie Germer. Maddie, where are you? There's Maddie. Everybody knows Maddie. She got John McCain elected president. Very effective, Maddie is. Nice to see you, Maddie. Thank you very much. Jim Christensen, I don't know if Jim is here or not, but he was an intern in my office. Jim's probably in the library, I suspect, where he always is. Then there was an intern by the name of Andrew Klein, who was sitting here with his George Will look-alike bow tie on. Many of you know Mr. Klein. We all know him because somehow he got through the net and became an intern, and he wasn't from Nebraska. This summer we gave him a visa to come work for us. But I must tell you very quickly, one of the things that most distinguished your Mr. Klein, his last week of internship with this very serious United States Senator was one that few of us will forget. It is, in fact, recorded for history. I returned from Nebraska on the afternoon, I believe, that Mr. Klein had escaped. And there on my desk was a handwritten note from Mr. Klein, accompanied by the front page of that week's edition of Roll Call. Now, many of you may know Roll Call. It's a fairly local newspaper in Washington, Capitol Hill. And I should be careful how I say this, since this is being recorded, but my friends at Roll Call know this is a joke. But there upon the front page, very serious publication, was a magnificent colored photo of one Mr. Klein. There he was, stretched out, shoes off, in a prone position, doing a rather significant poor man's Great Gatsby imitation, with his head in the lap of a young co-ed. I believe she was feeding him grapes. And the caption was, "Serious intern of Senator Chuck Hagel." He has brought great renown to me in my seriousness on foreign policy and all other matters. So, Andrew, thank you for putting me on the map. We're grateful. In that light, I also thought, Graham, about a conversation I had with Lord George Robertson last week, who I think all of you know as Secretary General of NATO, who is a wonderful man and a very effective Secretary General and a very strong friend of America, very thoughtful, although he talks occasionally about he had little to offer other than the fact his family had a Scotch distillery in Scotland, and I said, that's enough. And you know, the Queen knighted him, hence Lord. I, over the years, have gotten to know Lord Robertson rather well. And when we see each other, and we see each other 4 or 5 times a year all over the globe, and I'm always telling him that Nebraska is the center of the universe. And he has always played along with that and humored me. So as he came into town last week and gave a rather serious speech at the National Press Club at a very serious time, he brought the text of his speech with him to show me a very significant, maybe the most significant part of his speech. And it was, in fact, to enthusiastically, resoundingly endorse what I had been trying to explain to him for many years, that Nebraska was, in fact, the center of the universe, and very few things ever happen without a concentrated focus on how Nebraskans think. Within his speech, he quoted some of the minutes, the final minutes of the founding meeting, the last founding meeting of NATO in 1949. And he wasn't quite sure which defense minister said this, but in the debate over the definition of NATO, but more importantly, especially Mr. Stanton knows this, how do you explain it to the American public, to all of the NATO countries? How will they understand what we are trying to do? How is that defined in very understandable, simple terms? This historic quote was written down and used as, in fact, the center of gravity for NATO. It was something to the effect that this defense minister said, whatever we do, we must make certain that it is understandable to even a milkman in Omaha, Nebraska. Of course, I was very impressed and astounded, really, with even in those days, how much impact Nebraska had on world affairs. And we were looking for that milkman today. But that does not give you a very high expectation to hold me to. I recognize that for my speech tonight, but nonetheless, I shall make an effort. Ladies and gentlemen, I am flattered to be with you tonight to talk about something that is, of course, serious. That is September 11th, the consequences of September 11th, and how, in fact, those consequences will reshape our world. America, the world has been touched forever. We are changed forever. And it is upon that I would like to offer some thoughts. The title of my speech is The World Redefined. I launch off on these big ones. And here's why I say such an outrageous thing. 3 years ago, I came to this campus to deliver one of my first foreign policy speeches as a United States Senator. I spoke that September in 1998 of the new threats facing our nation in the 21st century, borderless threats. And this is a part of what I said, quote, terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction pose the greatest threats to global security in the 21st century. No nation will be immune, and no one nation can fight these enemies alone. Those engaging in these despicable acts must be made the pariahs of the civilized world, stopped at every turn and dealt with harshly. But we need coalitions built on mutual self-interest to deal with these great scourges to come, end of quote. I wish standing before you tonight that those words would have rung hollow, as many words I have said have rung hollow, I assure you. That America had never suffered this devastating blow. But the talons of terrorism have drawn American blood on American soil, and we are now engaged in an enduring struggle against this evil. All the world is engaged in this struggle. It is clear that this evil has one objective: to destroy free societies, civil order, market economies, and all aspects of tolerant cultures, respectful of the dignity and the worth of human life. This is not a clash of civilizations. Bin Laden and his followers, all who are connected to the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, and all other radical fundamentalists do not represent a culture. They represent intolerance and evil. Their actions serve but one need: their own purposes. They represent nothing good or positive. They represent no great teachings of humanity. They build nothing. They only destroy. What is it then that they fear? Look across America and see the landscapes dotted with mosques, synagogues, temples, and Christian churches of all denominations. We are a nation that has welcomed all peoples of all faiths because we respect all peoples and all faiths. We are one nation under God. Whose God or what God? We don't say. We don't say for a reason. We accept and respect each individual's right to pray to the God in which they believe. That is what the bin Ladens of the world fear. America and the world together are living at a time of historic proportions and unprecedented challenges. In the words of President Lincoln in 1862, quote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so must we think new and act new. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." End of quote. A new coalition of alliances is being formed to deal with a common enemy. That enemy is terrorism. This will redefine the world. Those coalitions that I referred to in my 1998 Harvard speech are now the new defining relationships in world affairs that will establish the world order for the next generation and beyond. These new coalitions are born from the vitalness of both national and international accommodation. They will self-adjust. They'll shift. They'll sometimes float. But they will be driven by and formed from the common threat of terrorism as its evil tentacles wrap around every aspect of our lives. This threat is of such enormity that it is difficult to fully understand it and the consequences that will flow from it. The redefinition of world affairs through this new global coalition will be, by necessity, developed in 3 stages. These stages will be shaped by both national and international security, economics, trade, politics, geopolitical, strategic considerations, and other interests. Each stage will be the consequence of the immediate challenges of our time, but all will evolve from additional challenges and pressures facing a real world. Stopping terrorism will not be the only purpose. It will be the catalyst and an important and initial purpose and challenge. But it will represent only the beginning purpose of a new world order. The first stage will be the prepare, protect, and prevent stage. We are currently embarked on this stage. Our nation as a government and all Americans as a people are preparing for this sustained effort against terrorism. We have taken and will continue to take the necessary domestic and international measures to protect our people and prevent future attacks. Our coalition of global partners has come together and will continue to come together. This stage will accommodate a broader range of national interests, allowing all nations vulnerable to terrorism to participate. The second stage is the interconnect stage. This will require accepting the reality that the world is, has been, and increases to be interconnected in every way. All 6 billion people living on the face of the earth are connected through and by telecommunications, world institutions, markets, energy, food, health, immigration, education, and the environment. This assimilation of the needs of a global community underpinned by a global economy is complicated. National and international policy adjustments will require courageous, thoughtful, and visionary leadership. Much like what President Truman, Secretary of State Marshall, and Senator Vandenberg were confronted with after World War II. In fact, there are many relevant parallels between now and what President Truman confronted after World War II. Great defining events in world history come every 50 to 100 years. We are living at such a time. These adjustments need not require abandoning national sovereignty. To the contrary, strong, sovereign nations are the pieces of a world mosaic. The mosaic will only be as strong as its pieces. For the United States, this second stage will be complicated and difficult. For many years, but most specifically since the implosion of the Soviet Union 10 years ago, the U.S. has sought new frameworks in dealing with a new world order, including our relationships with Russia, China, and our European allies. But we continued to make policy in a vacuum. We rarely connected our most vital policies, like national security, trade, energy, economic, diplomatic, health, environment, education, not only to each other in a domestic framework, but to our role and relationships in this new interdependent world. A clear example of this is the record number of unilateral economic sanctions we have placed on nations over the last few years. Over the last 2 weeks, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House International Affairs Committee have been wrestling with undoing unilateral sanctions we placed on China, Pakistan, India, Azerbaijan, and other nations, because we now need each other for our mutual self-interest. Mutual self-interest for the world. Unilateral sanctions are a dangerous liability, in my opinion, to our common interests against terrorism. And what about Iran, Libya, and other nations that are critical to U.S. efforts in addressing the short-term, but more importantly, the long-term challenges of terrorism? We have unilateral sanctions on them, so we don't speak to them. In fact, we can't speak to them. Now, who is isolating who? We communicate through third-party embassy contacts. Is it really in our self-interest not to find some imaginative avenues, ways, bridges to deal with these countries? I don't think so. And certainly the events of September 11th have made that very clear. This is but one policy area that will need to be addressed. Understanding that all of our policies are interconnected, nationally and internationally. Each policy has consequences, nationally and internationally. Inaction or no policy also has consequences. Trade is another example. The President of the United States has been without trade promotion authority, or the old referenced fast track authority, since 1994. Every American president since 1974 has been granted this authority because it is in the best interest of our country. Democratic Congresses have given it to Republican presidents. This has never been a partisan issue. It is interconnected to every dynamic of our national economy and security. Jobs, economic competitiveness, economy, international leadership, and our future. By not allowing the President the authority to negotiate trade agreements with other nations on behalf of our country is irresponsible, in my opinion, and will produce dangerous consequences for America's future position in the world. We are weakening America by this inattention and inaction. It is another interconnect that we have deferred at our own peril. This, too, will need attention and action. In the second stage of the redefinition of world affairs, it will be essential that America understand that nations cannot be standardized. Nations cannot be calibrated and evaluated on just one set of standards. The world does not work as all many Americas. Each nation has different pressures, problems, politics, complexities, strengths, and weaknesses, based on their own history, heritage, religious and ethnic mix, geopolitical placement, and other variables. This means, especially for the weaker emerging democracies and market economies, that nations are starting from different places and different reference points. We must clearly understand this. All nations cannot be judged the same way at the same time on the same standards. As we develop policy, harness resources to implement that policy, and lead a coalition of nations, it is critical that the complexities of these challenges be factored into our plans and our actions. That requires thinking not only as Americans, but also thinking as those trapped at the bottom with no hope. How and why do they respond? How and why do they respond as they do? This will require remarkable leadership, patience, understanding, vision, and yes, risk. This will require risk. Above all things, we must recognize the immense complications in dealing with terrorism and know that it will take an alignment of many nations with different and competing interests in order to defeat this insidious evil. Whatever our differences with China or other nations, those differences must be weighed against the urgency of dealing with the most important challenge to our way of life since World War II. The point is, we must hold our coalition's partners to a defined standard and commitment in participating in this sustained struggle against world terrorism. But be wise in factoring in the delicate and fragile dynamics of many of these countries. They must each contribute in their own way, but they must contribute. To further destabilize the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and the Caucasus could ignite an inferno that places the world in a far more dangerous position than it is today. This must be avoided. The Middle East peace process must get back on track. Leaders of the moderate Arab states, the U.S. and Europe, must force action on the PLA and Israeli government to get control of the most dangerous situation in the Middle East since 1973. If this escalation of violence continues, the risk of wider and deeper destabilization in this region and beyond, and the consequences that will follow, could present an uncontrollable dimension to this already combustible reality. This could be a disaster of enormous proportions. A Palestinian state must be part of a peace agreement. This is not new. We must get on with this. What we don't want to happen is to put governments in positions where options are limited, and Israel and the Palestinians feel they have no other way out. These are some of the many complexities of an interconnected world. America has not factored much of this reality into its foreign policy equations over the years. If we had understood better the historical and cultural dynamics in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam, we may have witnessed a different outcome in Vietnam. The third stage of the World Redefined will evolve from a combination of the successes of stages 1 and 2 and the molding of consequences from the unpredictable events that will yet occur. But it will need to be shaped now. It is the restructuring stage. Framing relationships, alliances, policies, events for long-term structures and long-term governance. Anticipating long-term responses to challenges. And providing financial as well as human investment in economic, educational, cultural, trade programs, and relationships that will have positive human returns. Much of this third stage will depend on how successful America is now in leading this newly defined grand coalition and making the correct and difficult decisions. The effort and process will be imperfect. We will make mistakes, but it must be accomplished. We have no choice. We must respond just as every generation of Americans has responded to its great challenge of the time. within the universe of much of the chaos and turmoil that we will work through during this struggle, must come a framework of responsible and democratic governance for these lost nations. That, of course, is the end objective. All else is irrelevant if we fail here. This course will be intensely debated as so-called nation building and other such terms. But make no mistake, it is the fundamental piece of every part of our effort here. It is what Secretary Powell did in designating Ambassador Richard Haass as special envoy to negotiate the structure of a new government in Afghanistan to replace the Taliban. The free world has everything at risk. Our lifestyles, as we have known them, will be fundamentally altered if we fail. It would mean that for the first time in American history, the next generation would not be better off than the preceding generation. Fewer options, less opportunities, more global instability, less security, with more responsibility and far more problems. This is not the America or the world I want for my 8 and 10-year-olds to inherit. Central to our long-term efforts against terrorism is addressing the underlying social and economic causes of much of the world's instability. This instability serves as a breeding ground for all forms of radicalism. This focus is critical if we are to have any hope of long-term success in our war against terrorism. And it represents the most difficult aspects of this long-term struggle, ones that the developed nations have essentially deferred over the years. American economic strength will be a centerpiece of our sustained effort to work with this global coalition to stabilize a restructured world. It will mean that there will be significant shifts in the U.S. and the world economies, growth patterns, areas of growth, like employment realignment and economic readjustment. We must be prepared for this. We must be prepared for this. All of this represents, to some degree, a dynamic market economy. These shifts and adjustments would occur to some extent anyway. However, the fundamental interconnects of a world economy, stability, trade, energy, capital, and people, will represent a certain uncontrollable dynamic to these shifts. A critical piece of the world economic picture is energy. America must have a national energy plan. The core of this plan must be energy independence. This means a wider, deeper, more diversified energy portfolio produced in the United States. Energy that we control. It will include conservation and environmental programs. It must. But the focus must be on energy production. Is there anybody tonight who does not worry about the dangerous dependence the West has on foreign oil and the increasing dependence on foreign oil, including the United States? Foreign oil especially coming from the area of the world that is most vulnerable to instability, the Middle East. This is a very dangerous reality, one that must receive our attention if we want the 21st century to be less volatile than the 20th century. Trade is also a stabilizing factor and must get immediate attention from all of us who have the responsibility for making policy in this country. When nations have fewer economic options, there's no growth, no jobs, no opportunities, poverty, hunger, disease, and worst of all, no hope. This results in base instability and predictable revolution. We must pull our trade policy up out of the underbrush of technicality, perfecting amendments, parochial interests, and understand the folly of squandering precious time and not dealing with the larger overriding parts of trade, which build not just economic success, but social bridges and social success as well. It all connects. That means hope, stability, security, and growth everywhere. We cannot allow America to remain hostage to every specific labor, environmental, and human rights violation in our policymaking. Yes, we must also always strive to influence nations' behaviors and policies in these areas. and hold them accountable. But we cannot risk the collapse of the very structures for change for the better, that can and will achieve these desired goals by overburdening the systems and overloading the circus. Then what do we have? What would replace it? What do we have to replace it if we destroy the system that represents the world's best possibilities for positive human improvement? America's economy is the engine that pulls the world economy. Our economic policy making is forever changed, like every dynamic of our world. This economic policy will now must include, in both specific and general ways, national security and foreign policy requirements. Economic policy will no longer be an enhancement to foreign policy, but in fact it will be a partner in foreign policy. The sooner we appreciate this, understand this, the sooner we can begin addressing the subterranean factors that consistently complicate and sabotage our foreign policy and national security. If the world plunges into a world recession, the complexity and difficulty of our task becomes enormous. The President and Congress must stay clearly focused on the economic piece of this war, for without it, we risk a very long, protracted, and unpredictable and unprecedented string of setbacks in our global effort. The economic priority is as important as any priority we have here. There are no guarantees of success as we move through these three stages and attempt to build a more stable, freer, and more just world in the 21st century. We are not guaranteed of success or failure. But we do know that American leadership will be required for us to achieve these great challenges. In conclusion, allow me to step back and peer into the American soul in response to the September 11th attacks. These attacks have caused us all to conduct a personal inventory of ourselves. Who are we? What's important in our lives? What kind of a world will our children inherit? What are our most important responsibilities as the current trustees of this great land and this hopeful world? The things we value, cherish, and love most: our family, our friends, our way of life, our country, our institutions, like this great institution, have taken on a deeper, more significant dynamic and significance than ever before for each one of us. There is emotion, and passion, and fear, and anger, defiance, all wrapped down deep in each of us. We are going through a societal reflection. As a nation and as individuals, we are experiencing both the physical and psychological effects of September 11th. The interwoven fabric of American society has been threaded with a new reality: terrorism. How do we deal now, personally, as a people, with this new reality? America and the world, personal and institutional, all must find a new center of gravity. Each American will need to tap a measure of resolve to get through some of the dark days that lie ahead, and there will be dark days that lie ahead. I do not doubt our ability to dig down deep to find the resolve, the courage, and inspiration to deal with this new challenge, nor should any of you. Much like I saw in Vietnam in 1968, selfless acts of heroism, of uncommon courage from the most ordinary citizen soldiers. That's America. We have a new seriousness of purpose that will define your generation. This will not mean we won't laugh, we won't dance. We do and we will. But over the years, we have glided merrily along on a carefree cushion of limited challenge. Our society has been without guideposts. The last few years, it's been kind of a societal laziness. We haven't asked much from our society, haven't asked much from you, quite honestly. We haven't asked much from ourselves. We have limited our expectations for ourselves and each other. Look at politics. We've defined down expectations, conduct, and standards in our candidates and office holders. We're easily swayed to dismiss those higher standards. The stock market's had an effortless, unprecedented, meteoric rise year after year after year. We fight antiseptic wars by dropping bombs from thousands of feet above those that we would destroy. Less messy, of course, that way. Our theaters, our music, our TV has been filled with trash and nonsense. Our young people are experiencing the curse of devastating illegal drugs. We continue to defer the difficult policy decisions for the future of this country, like Medicare and Social Security reform, because of a lack of courage on my part and my colleagues. And we've accepted all of this as part of progress in a modern, impersonal, internet world of sophisticated living. This is not the first time this has occurred, only the most recent. In 1939, Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons, and he said, quote, "Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, courage, confusion of counsel until the emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history." End of quote. America is undergoing a self-correction process. It will be the innate goodness, the courage, and common sense of the American people that will pull our country out of the swamp of confusion and produce a great victory for mankind. Maybe the greatest victory. It has always been so with America. As a familiar Harvard graduate said in his presidential inaugural address in 1961, quote, "In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world." John Fitzgerald Kennedy. America will continue to stand as the beacon of hope for all mankind, the inspiration for all people who yearn to be free everywhere and risk everything for God's special gift. America will stand together as we have always stood together when our nation was threatened. We will rise above our sorrow, find courage in our fears, and join with the generations before who fought to defend liberty. And like them, we will defeat this enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Senator Hagel has a few minutes for questions before he's going to have to make his way back to Washington tonight because the Senate meets first thing in the morning. But so the questions, let me ask you to put your questions succinctly, identify yourself, and we'll take as many as we can for the time we have. Let's start at this microphone.
My name is Mike Weissman. I'm a research assistant here at the Kennedy School. If there's one thing that concerns me more than anthrax, it's smallpox. The Dark Winter exercise, which started with theoretical occurrence of smallpox in 3 states, ended 13 days later with smallpox having spread to 25 states and 15 other countries. And in 1972, when smallpox broke out in Yugoslavia, it was only contained by the vaccination of 18 million people in 10 days and basically a declaration of martial law in the country. If a totalitarian state is good for one thing, I guess it's that. But realities in the U.S. Are different, thankfully. So I wonder what your view is of the smallpox threat, and specifically what would be your view of a wide-scale revaccination of the population to prevent broad outbreaks, since dealing with it would be so difficult after the fact.
I will try to respond with as brief an answer. The only kind I have, actually. My reservoir is limited. Your evaluation of the differences is correct. Start with that. But to your bigger point, we are generally prepared in this country through our public health services and our networks to deal with most anything that would hit us in the way of bioterrorism. That does not mean that we need to do far more than what we have done. We will do. I have introduced a bill last week in conjunction with others. Senator Kennedy, Senator Frist have been leaders on this over the last 2 years. We are preparing our first responders. The interconnect of state, local, national has to work, has to be far better equipped and coordinated. And without going into hours and hours, which we could on this, I would then summarize my point this way. This is a priority that is second to none. Bioterrorism, chemical terrorism, with all levels of government. We are addressing it. I can assure you the Congress and the President is addressing it, not just daily, but hourly, minute by minute. Secretary Thompson was in to see us again today. We need to do more. We will do more. But I am confident that with the facilities, with the resources we have, we could handle just about anything that comes. Now, one last point. Realize that if terrorists, state-sponsored or whatever, are to use smallpox, anthrax, different forms of bioterrorism, there are significant limitations to what they can do with that. Production facilities, storage facilities, atmospherics, delivery capability, and all those dynamics that go into it. So the American people needs to know, yes, it's serious, but there also are very significant limitations to bioterrorism. Thank you.
Good. Let's go to this.
Thank you, Professor Ellison, and thank you, Senator, for being here. My name is Josh Weiner. I'm a junior here. And I want to start off by saying that I've greatly admired the way that you and your colleagues and the President have handled this crisis since it's happened. Like many people, though, I was very shocked to find out that our vulnerabilities were such that people who weren't even supposed to be in the country were able to commandeer a plane, buzz the Pentagon, then the Capitol, and then the White House, and then back to the Pentagon and crash and fly a plane into the two towers 18 minutes apart. Americans, I'm sure, know, going through metal detectors at airports, that security isn't great, but we were very surprised to see how vulnerable we really were. My question to you is, were people in Congress or in other government agencies in the executive branch, for example, aware of some of these vulnerabilities? If so, why was more not done to protect America? And if not, why weren't they? And I hope this doesn't sound accusatory.
No, it's a legitimate question, and that question has been asked thousands of times by everybody and should be, and it will continue to be asked in oversight hearings in the Congress. Well, first of all, we all have to take some responsibility for what happened. We were briefed many, many times to talk about dark winter. Senator Nunn was up to brief the Foreign Relations Committee and former CIA Director Jim Woolsey just days before September 11th on all the potential possibilities here of various forms of terrorism. George Tenet, CIA, FBI, we have been warned. We've seen the intellectual dynamic of this put before us, but we've never seen the reality. Of course, there is nothing like reality that is able to coalesce action, especially in an open democratic society when it takes committee after committee and Republicans and Democrats and presidents. And by the way, I'm not using this to cast aside any responsibility we have. We all have to take some responsibility. But until something occurs to shock society and to shock Congress and all of us into action, unfortunately, that's often what it takes, whether it's Pearl Harbor or whatever it is. Now, what are we doing about it? We've been warned about the theory of it. What we now can do is deal with it as it is and go through, as I said, the first stage of this process, which we are doing, and that is to protect and prevent and prepare. And we're doing that. Every policy now is focused on that. Huge amounts of resources are flowing into this. Airport security, every kind of security. Now, I would add one other thing. We are the most free, open, mobile society in the history of man. 285 million people. We do not live in a risk-free society. Should something have happened like it happened on September 11th? Absolutely not. But we have to understand, as we prepare our people, that there will be actions occur, I suspect. We're going to try and avoid that, but all citizens must help us. What we need to do is get back to a semblance of confidence that this country has in its systems, in its enforcement procedures, in its leaders, in process, that not only will they get on a plane, but everything in their lives can get back to some sense of normalcy and also stay alert. And I know that's not a good answer to your question, but there is not a good answer to your question. Should we have known? Absolutely. Should we have known more? Absolutely. Make no mistake, what happened September 11th in a period of 1 hour was one of the most sophisticated, probably the most sophisticated terrorist act in the history of man. The support, the training, the technology, the intelligence, the financing, everything that went into that was astounding. And I think it did catch everybody by surprise.
Thank you.
Let's go to the balcony here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Richard Parker. I'm a student in government at the Extension School. And I just had a question about talking about responsibility and to face the challenges of the future. What role should nuclear power play in our energy policy as something we can face, control, and deal with without having to rely on foreign oil, at least for...
Well, I think we should and must get to a larger dependency on nuclear power. It's safe, it's cheap, it's clean, and unfortunately there has been a lot of nonsense spread around about nuclear power. The problem that we have with nuclear power today is nuclear waste. And if the Congress would finally get some courage and do what we should have been doing 20 years ago, which in fact is on the books, there's a law to make a final decision about Yucca Mountain or somewhere to deposit that spent nuclear fuel, then we would have it. It's a very safe form of energy and very reasonable and very cheap, and environmentally it's as sound as about any form of energy you can get. Look at the nations that use it, 40%, 60%. Connecticut, one of your neighbor states here, is one of the largest users of nuclear power. I think their nuclear power use produces over 60% of electricity.
Vermont also.
I'm sorry?
Vermont is a big one.
Vermont's another one, that's right. But I think it needs to be part of that wider, deeper, diversified energy portfolio that I was talking about.
Thank you.
Let's go to the balcony here.
Hi, my name is Caroline Adler. I'm a sophomore at the college from California. And my question has to do with the way that certain European countries have reacted to the events of September 11th. And most of them have supported us. One in particular, Italy. 2 weeks ago, I read a speech of the Prime Minister where he urged Americans, using language more strongly than Americans themselves have been using, telling us to fight back and, to take control, while at the same time, Italy has not been helping us militarily. And being Italian, I wanted to know what sorts of things the government of Italy is dealing with where in speeches publicly they can tell Americans to fight and use language that I even think is inappropriate and yet not physically help us.
Well, first, there's not a European nation that I am aware of that has not enthusiastically supported our efforts, not just by what they're saying, but through intelligence and bases and support. First, on your main point about why aren't the Italians fighting? Have faith in your nation and your government. Right now, we can't put any more fighters on the battlefield. There are very specific military assets now being used in what we are doing. The French, the Germans, a lot of nations have put before us as the entire NATO alignment has added to the military inventory of where we can draw from. The Italians are certainly part of that. It's not a matter of that they have not done that. It's just a matter of we can't use those military assets right now. I can assure you, without violating anything here, that the Italians are very much a part of this coalition in supporting their bases, intelligence, and other things that I can't talk about. And if there comes a time, and there may well come a time, when Italian military assets can be used, they will be used.
Good evening. My name is Clay Pell. I'm from Newport, Rhode Island, and a freshman at the college. How much should the United States be willing to invest financially in the development and strengthening of struggling nations, particularly those hardest hit in Africa by AIDS?
Well, we need to invest in all the nations and emerging democracies and support and help and encourage where we can. But I think we have to be realistic about this. It is not all the fault of the Western nations for the plight of many of the underdeveloped nations. Like the United States or any nation, there are unfortunately nations who have had very bad leaders, very corrupt leaders. And it's not a matter of the United States or the Western nations not putting resources in there. But these people who unfortunately are trapped at the bottom have been held hostage to their own corrupt leaders. Now, that's not the only reason. We can do more. I said so in my speech. We must do more. But we have to be careful to weigh this without the kind of responsible leadership that these nations are going to require and need to help move them along, then we're somewhat limited to what we can do. Now, what I have objected to, and I said it very directly in my comments tonight, is this standardization that somehow we are holding everybody hostage, in a sense, to our standards. And I said tonight, before we came down here, the standards of America 2000, or the standards of America 1900, or the standards of America 1850. We said 80 years ago, half the people in this room couldn't vote in this country. Is that a human rights violation? Well, I bet most people would probably consider that a human rights violation, not to let women vote. But yet 80 years ago in the United States of America, women couldn't vote. 150 years ago, we had slavery. There was a reason in the mid-60s we had to pass the civil rights laws. So where I have been most critical is in that area, that we've somehow calibrated all nations on the same basis. That's dangerous. But both sides of this need to take responsibility. But we need to focus, as I clearly said here, in those areas that are undeveloped. Please.
My name is Dovie Sachs, and I'm a sophomore here at the college. Senator Hagel, you made the parallel to the situation that President Truman faced after World War II. And when he took office on April 12, 1945, quite felicitously, he faced an extremely precarious international conflagration with very minimal foreign policy experience. And revisionist historians now affirm quite certainly that he was only allowed to see the international scene through the eyes of ambassadors and advisors who were extremely hawkish, and that many also affirm that in the course of marshaling strong and broad national congressional support for the Truman Doctrine and its billions of dollars of expenditures, he also helped to create a lot of the threat that he was marshaling and preparing to fight. I think the parallel holds quite well. My question is, how is it that the current policy, the current bombing in Afghanistan, is not creating a backlash far greater than the initial threat that we faced on September 11th?
Well, first, I would take some issue with your premise on President Truman. Let's not forget some of the institutions that were formed, not military, under President Truman. United Nations. I wouldn't consider that a militaristic organization. He drove that, as did his cabinet. The World Bank, the IMF. The World Bank and IMF, as a result of Bretton Woods, were set up to help developing nations and peoples that needed the help. I think Harry Truman did a remarkably spectacular job in the human side of this as well as other. Were there mistakes made? Of course there are. This business of foreign policy, any business, is imperfect and imprecise, and we'll make mistakes, and we'll continue to make mistakes. You'll make mistakes when you're running things. But I wanted to put that in, well, maybe not, I hope not. But I think that's important, not to debate you on the subject, but sometimes I think Harry Truman gets a bit of a bad rap on some of that, and I think history's proven pretty correctly that Harry Truman was a very humanist president. Now, your question about backlash. There's been backlash, as you have followed the news, from some of the Islamic nations and those who I think, unfortunately, do not define the difference between what bin Laden and al-Qaeda is about versus an Islamic world. Bin Laden and the Islamic fundamentalists have been successful in many ways in linking the two. Jihad, holy warriors. We're at war against Muslims. Well, there isn't anybody here, I don't think, that believes that we're at war against Muslims. We're not. That isn't the issue here. But bin Laden's been very successful with this. And when you are dealing with parts of the world that don't allow people to have any ability to be informed or educated or think, you're going to have this. And it's not new. History of mankind is replete with this. It's only new because we now have, thanks to Mr. Stanton and others, an ability to peek in the world and see the world, which I think is a big improvement and gives our people a far better base to judge the world when they see some of this. So I don't mean to, again, to debate you on this, but I fully acknowledge, as I said in my remarks, that we will make policy here that will be flawed, and that's as it is. But I think before you judge anybody too harshly, understand that what Harry Truman was up against, he couldn't wait. There was not going to be a time, let's go to Harvard and debate it. The world was hanging there. George Bush is of the same situation. You don't have time to go debate it. The world is looking at us and saying, what are you going to do? That's as it is. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, and I apologize for the dozens of others that won't be done, but we're right here at the balcony. For a short question, please. I'll give a short answer.
Senator, I'm Benjamin Bolger. I'm actually a student at the Graduate School of Design. And very briefly, for a long time, there was a governing principle of mutually assured destruction that helped prevent weapons of mass destruction to be used. And now with rogue nations and terrorist organizations that may or someday might have the capacity for such capabilities, I know there's talk about abilities to intercept missiles that are launched. But what is the long-term paradigm strategy that you feel would effectively address nuclear weapons and so forth? What are some new ideas that you feel should be taken incredibly serious?
Well, I think the first thing, and there's been great debate on this issue, and I'm going to try to be very brief, but you've opened something up that we could be here for days on. Graham understands a lot of this. A lot of people here have a far stronger base to work from than I do on this, but since I am a senator, we have the luxury of saying anything that doesn't make any sense and rarely held accountable. But two quick observations. I think George Bush and President Putin are on the right track. First, eliminate this paradigm of mutually assured destruction. In my opinion, that's wrong. We shouldn't hold mankind captive to that anymore. That worked. That worked for a long time. But we're on to new challenges, just as Winston Churchill said, just as Abraham Lincoln said, as John Kennedy said. Great vision that these men all had. We have to find a better way. I sense that in your question. What's the better way? Well, I think the better way is starting with the realization that the mutually assured destruction doesn't work anymore, won't work. We need to find a better way. That isn't easy, by the way. I still have many colleagues in many nations who believe we're just fine with that. Putin doesn't believe that, and he said so. He doesn't believe that. Now, how do we make this work? Well, I think anything that decelerates the nuclear capability of nations and starts moving them down, capacity, capability, the leverage, is in the right direction. And we need to find that. We're going to be grappling with this for a long time. You all are going to be dealing with it. Unfortunately, I think. I hope not, but I think you will. We need to keep making progress, moving and finding. An event of September 11th, I talked about it in here, mutually common denominator, mutual self-interest policies that will bring us together. Putin goes to NATO 2 weeks ago, says an incredible thing. The president of Russia went to NATO headquarters 2 weeks ago and said what? Said, don't worry, I'm not too worried about NATO enlargement right up to my western border. Incredible thing he said. Why is that? Because he knows the threat to Russia is not coming from the West. He also knows that this nuclear threat is real. He knows that we need to find a new, as you say it, paradigm, you're right, framework. And we will get there. But I think the direction that Bush is taking is right. I think September 11th accelerates that awareness, and I think you will see a considerable shift in the Congress on this.
Thank you.
What about, thank you.
Let me say on behalf of all of us how pleased we are to have had Senator Hagel back. I told you he's a representative of great good sense. His Churchill quote is one of my favorites. I'll stop the evening with one other Churchill quote, which Churchill said, in defeats like September 11, defiance. In war, resolution. In victory, magnanimity. So we're glad that we have Senator Hagel there for all three steps.
Thank you, sir.
Great, great. It's a terrific speech.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Sure, I'll see you at good times for a game sometime. Yeah, definitely.
All right, take care. Good luck at the game this weekend.